Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show that tries its best to take the edge off the looming apocalypse by narrating it all in a soothing British voice. I am your host, Si Wister, and this week we're tackling your questions ranging from whether World War III has already started, to whether Trump was right about Europe under the radar wars and why Iran's regime is still standing. Surprising, we know. There's lots to unpack today. Some of it fun, some of it really rather dark. So let's jump into our first question from, oh my lord, Juan the Jet Dryer 7580. All right then. Who writes, big ass question. Has World War III started? We just don't know it yet. Now, this is a question we see constantly in our comments section, especially over the last 9 months or so, and it's not that hard to see why, is it? Things are bad right now in so many places at once, and with a few notable exceptions, those bad situations don't seem as if they're really getting any better. But has World War III actually started? I mean, no, not yet, but that doesn't mean a larger process hasn't already begun. Wars, they don't happen in a vacuum, and the world wars of the 20th century were no exception to that. Both wars came at a time of rising international conflict: the Second Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Balkan Wars, the Moroccan crises, and a major period of geopolitical shifts in alliances before World War I, and the war in Manchuria, the expansion of the German Empire in Europe, the Spanish Civil War, and Italy's conflicts in Africa before World War II. It was a busy time, do you remember? Now, there is a strong argument right now that between Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, the Sahel, and so on and so forth, we're witnessing a similar period of heightened tensions and chaos that you'd expect to see before a world war kicks off. And while not every period like this in global history leads to a world war, we haven't yet seen a world war that wasn't preceded by something just like this. But as for whether this situation is a world war, no. To be blunt, the question underestimates just how catastrophically bad even a non-nuclear world war would be. It's a useful rhetorical device for the purposes of drawing attention to a period of genuinely worrying conflict escalation across the globe. But as bad as this situation is, it is important to remember that it can still get so much worse, and it can get so much worse by orders of magnitude. A conventional world war that truly harnesses the economic power of major war-ready nations and places those massive advanced militaries into direct conflict at large scale is already an exponentially more damaging situation than what we can observe right now. And if such a war involves a nuclear exchange, well, then that's another order of magnitude, isn't it? Now, look, we're not sure if that's optimistic exactly, but when we're discussing global conflicts, perspective does matter. The threshold for a global situation to count as a world war is a lot higher than this, and rightfully so. Modern civilizations with modern weaponry have the capacity to ensure that we would remember the chaos today as the easy times. So that's scary, isn't it? Was Trump right about Europe? Next up, thank you to Derek Mitchell 2686. All right, who asks? Okay, so, while I personally really don't agree with how it happened, him upending our long-held relations since World War II, insulting other nations, etc., do you think Trump was in a weird way what Europe needed to hear to get serious about its own defense? All right. Honestly, there wasn't even anything weird about it. Since this channel switched from history to current affairs content, which was a good decision for our views. Thank you, guys. The one drum we've consistently beating is the one marked "Get your shit together, Europe." Although, through a strange combination of inertia, fear of Russia, and a deluded sense that America would be our BFF and protector for all eternity, European leaders allowed crisis after crisis to come and go without ever saying, maybe now would be a good time to stop selling off our old military stock and slashing our defense budgets and, start rearming maybe. Yeah, let's do it. Okay, come on. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 should have, at a bare minimum, killed projects like Nord Stream 2 stone dead. Russia's deployment of a chemical weapon on the streets of Salisbury in 2018 in the UK should have been final proof that the Kremlin cannot be trusted. And in a sane world, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 should have triggered a campaign of mass rearmament across the continent. And yet, through all of this, European leaders did what our continent does oh so well. They dithered, they talked, they held meetings about maybe holding some more meetings. Even initiatives that seemed impressive at first, such as the then-Chancellor Olaf Scholz announcing a special €100 billion fund to help rearm Germany, wound up under-delivering. In short, the continent just kept on sleepwalking on, unable to conceive that its holiday from history was, in fact, over. We were simply unable to believe that a European way of life might soon have to be defended with steel and gunpowder. Of course, there were European nations that took the threat seriously. Lonely voices like Poland and the Baltic states warning that we needed to boost defense spending to survive. But the biggest countries like France and Germany, kinda shamefully absent, guys. And then came Trump's re-election. The seeming pivot of the USA towards Russia, the humiliation of Zelensky in the White House, J.D. Vance's scornful remarks about the European armies that had sacrificed their sons fighting in America's Middle East wars. And make no mistake to Europeans like us, those moments were shocking, they were shameful. Like having someone you thought was a friend walk into your living room and take a on a photo of your family while also somehow kicking you repeatedly in the balls. But perhaps it was also what our continent needed to hear. Now let's be clear, Trump's return has united Europe in ways that even Putin's armies marauding across Ukraine could not. Had Kamala Harris won the election, there would not have been a pledge to hike NATO spending to 5% across the board. Germany would not now be embarking on a vast military build-up that will turn its army into the biggest in Europe. France would not be seriously talking about sharing its nuclear deterrent. So, to return to the question, the answer has to be yes. Depending on how you feel about him, Trump either gave Europe the tough love it needed for over a decade, or else acted so horrifically that it shattered any remaining illusions in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris that America would protect us. Either way, the result is the same. The biggest legacy of a president dedicated to making America great again may yet turn out to be transforming Europe into the superpower that it always should have been. All right, now let's go to Chris Meister, 1945. What country would be most likely to step into Yemen and try to squash the Houthis? What action would trigger the event? All right, well, unfortunately, it's a bit of a $1 million question right now, isn't it? As the Houthis prove that they're not just willing to ramp up attacks again, but can use a wider range of tactics with greater efficacy than ever before. And that's after months of targeted airstrikes, primarily from the United States and Israel, that were supposed to diminish their ability to pose a threat. But there's a reason that no nation has gone further in intervening, so let's run through a quick process of elimination to account for all of the usual suspects. The United States, of course, has the manpower, the superior military hardware, and the logistical capacity to put boots on the ground in a full-scale Yemen intervention. But the nation clearly lacks the political will to actually pull the trigger, with a president who explicitly ran on the promise that future foreign interventions would be avoided. No European nation has the capacity to intervene by themselves, and the one with arguably the best resources, that's France, has recently been pushed out of foreign conflicts in Africa, where it has far deeper historical ties than it's ever had in Yemen. An intervention by Russia wouldn't just be real difficult to achieve given its preoccupation with Ukraine, but it would go directly against Russia's own geopolitical interests to intervene against an Iran-backed non-state actor. China is both strongly averse to foreign occupations and has few qualms about the Houthis, who have overseen vital oil smuggling routes from Iran to China for years. Nor does any nation in the Middle East have the combination of will and capability to intervene in Yemen directly. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have taken their shots and failed, with Saudi Arabia lacking the military capability to intervene in 2025, and the Emirates benefiting from a broader Middle Eastern chaos that the Houthis helped cultivate. Other powerful nations in the Arab world, like Egypt and Turkey, have their own problems at home and wouldn't want to deal with the domestic political consequences of an intervention. Israel is already keeping tabs on plenty of adversaries and has structured its military in a way that ensures a robust homeland defense at the expense of any real capability to engage in large-scale operations abroad. So, as for which country is most likely to directly intervene against the Houthis, well, really, none of them. If we had to pick one, though, it would probably be the United States, simply because the combination of operational capability and geopolitical will is slightly more favorable than any of the others, but even the most likely choice, still highly improbable. A coalition operation could have some chance of success, leveraging Emirati and Saudi ground troops in collaboration with Yemen's internationally recognized government, and perhaps with the large-scale involvement of mercenary PMCs in order to keep other nations' uniformed soldiers out of the fight. But although there were reports earlier this year of ongoing talks to this effect, those talks just didn't seem to lead anywhere if they happened at all. As for what it might take to actually prompt the international community to make an intervention happen, the decision may simply come down to relative cost. If Houthi attacks on the Red Sea become a regular occurrence again, especially if they're done with the same intensity we saw in these recent strikes, then Red Sea shipping will have to be protected somehow. But as costly as it is to reroute shipping around Africa in a world where the Red Sea becomes too risky, those costs may still be easier to bear than the cost of a years-long multinational intervention. As the Houthis have proven before, they are really capable fighters on their own territory, and any occupation of Yemen would have to be long and bloody in order to defeat them so extensively that they'd no longer pose a transnational threat. All right, let's move on to another question. Ian Hamilton 213 says, "Hi there, been a fan of the channel for 2 years now." Thank you, Ian. My question is, with everyone saying the Iranian regime is weak and there for the taking, why hasn't it fallen already? And will Western endorsement of an opposition help push it forward? All right, well, not all regime instability is created equal, and Iran is one case of a regime that's simultaneously pretty unstable, yet has learned to keep its balance just well enough to prevent it from toppling over. A big part of the reason why is the divided nature of Iran's opposition. The regime is widely disliked across much of the nation, but the rationale for people's dislike of the regime is dependent on ideology. Religious hardliners and hardcore nationalists are displeased with the regime because of the degree of difficulty it's experienced in fighting Israel, the nation's inability to overcome international sanctions and get through its economic malaise, and even perceptions that the ruling regime isn't hardline enough compared to what some of these more extreme factions would expect. On the other hand, there's the pro-democracy, anti-clerical and globalist opposition factors who would like to see Iran's hardliners fall from power so that Iran can peacefully reintegrate with the rest of the world. Those stances are quite diametrically opposed, and as a result, Iran's opposition doesn't have any sort of cohesive vision for the future or any single promise of an alternative. The Iranian regime does well at disrupting anything that might ever lead to the two sides finding common ground, and while there are circumstances that might unify the hardliners and the reformers against the regime, those are few and far between. An even larger bombing campaign from Israel could be one such scenario, hitting not just military and nuclear targets, but oil fields, economic targets, and civilian population centers indiscriminately. Or perhaps some sort of major scandal could implicate the Ayatollahs and other high-level regime officials in accusations that outrage both the hardliners and the reformers. That's in contrast to events like the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, driving reformers into the streets but failing to stir up any real discontent among the hardliners. But information access is restricted, speech is sharply curtailed, and there are few, if any, ways to legally organize large-scale public resistance ahead of time. Any societal upheaval that's capable of bringing down the regime would need to come on so suddenly that instruments of state repression cannot react in time, and it would need to mobilize grassroots activists rapidly across the country's political divide. As for whether Western endorsement will help the regime fall, well, it probably would, but it would only have a limited effect. Again, if the Ayatollahs are going to fall because of a mass-organized resistance within Iran, that movement will have to bring together highly polarized factions around a common cause. For the West to openly and enthusiastically support a resistance movement may be immediately disqualifying for Iran's discontented hardliners, causing them to react with suspicion or hostility, even if the goals of a reformist uprising are in line with their own objectives. If we're talking about an exceptionally powerful movement from the reformists alone, or a potential military coup or covert Western support, well, that's a different story. But if it's a question of open support for regime change, the West can't help nearly as much as we in our Western bubble might believe. In the unlikely event that popular outrage could unify hardliners and the reformists against the regime, then the most productive thing for the global West to do might simply be to shut up and let it happen. Next up, Daniel N. 6700 says, the war in Sudan is a big deal most people don't know about. What another war, etc. that's also quite a big deal, but also under the radar. Now, the interesting thing about this question is that you can define a big deal in a couple of ways, and how you define it does impact the type of war that might qualify as an answer here. For instance, we could try and look at conflicts that are affecting the lives of the greatest proportion of people in a given nation. In that case, serious contender, of course, has to be Haiti's ongoing meltdown, where gang-imposed blockades of ports, roads, and airports have effectively plunged most of the country into a hunger crisis. The World Food Programme estimates that over half of all Haitians lack enough to eat, while over 10% of the population are currently homeless, displaced by the eye-watering violence. But while this channel has long advocated for people to take Haiti's crisis more seriously, the sad truth is that it's only a big deal right now for Haitians themselves. In this, it's different from Sudan's civil war, which has managed to pull in a whole host of regional powers from UAE to Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Russia. So, If by a big deal we mean a conflict with a lot of geopolitical impact, we'd probably want to look elsewhere. For example, to Myanmar's collapsing into warring ethnic states, not just because the fighting has provided cover for crime gangs to set up massive drug trafficking and online scamming operations, but also because of the ever-expanding role of China. Yet even this might have nothing compared to the ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. The short 4-day war that the two fought earlier this year did make headlines around the world, but once the fighting stopped, attention in the West drifted away, despite the ever-present threat that it could reignite into a much more serious clash between nuclear-armed powers. India has still not reversed its suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, which spells existential trouble for Pakistan. For its part, Islamabad has tried to pin recent terror attacks on Pakistani soil on India, almost as if it's looking for an excuse to restart the fight. And finally, there are the conflicts that are currently low level, but have clear potential to accelerate into something oh so much more devastating. In this bucket, we'd put the ongoing conflict in the Sahel between the military juntas ruling Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso on the one hand, and a collection of separatist rebels and Islamist extremists on the other. Compared to Sudan, the death toll is still relatively limited in these conflicts, but with insurgent groups staging ever more spectacular attacks, the possibility is clearly there for whole nations to either fragment or to be overrun by terror groups. For the wider world, the threat is that these places would then become lawless safe havens for extremists from where mass casualty attacks targeting America and Europe could be planned and launched. Really though, the truth is that almost any conflict can become impactful at short notice. Back on April the 15th, 2023, almost no one predicted that the fighting in Khartoum would turn Sudan into one of the world's biggest catastrophes. And to our lasting embarrassment, we here at WarFronts thought the conflict would be over so quickly that we didn't even bother to cover the outbreak. Sorry about that. In other words, what seems like a minor thing today could easily become tomorrow's crisis. For that reason, if for no other, it's always worth keeping at least one eye on the world's trouble spots, no matter how small or under the radar the fighting may be. Next up, Adam Green 8421 asks, there is a theory that the big three powers, USA, Russia, and China, are carving up the world between themselves. This would consolidate resources and power for each. Using your experience from monitoring conflicts around the world for a while now, do you see anything to support this trend? Things like the Belt and Road Initiative from China or heavy Russian presence in Africa, for example. Okay, so definitely, there is something here. After all, it was only about 2 months ago that Donald Trump made headlines by implying and insinuating across a few appearances and public statements that he'd be open to precisely that sort of arrangement. Russia, China, and the United States each assert dominion over resources and parts of the world that are explicitly theirs and sort of lose their interest in part of the world where they are explicitly somebody else's. And certainly, you've hit on something with the initiatives that you've described, China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's expansion across Africa. Those are each clear examples of Russia and China attempting to build long-term geopolitical influence, secure stable and well-protected access to resources, and ice out major powers from those spots. What we would disagree with, however, is the neatness of the whole idea. While all three of these nations are in the process of snapping up as much value as they can, they're not going to do it in the traditional way, where we could neatly color smaller nations on a map based on where their ultimate loyalties lie. The world is far more interconnected than it's ever been. There's an entire digital domain to be considered. Borders are fluid, loyalties are for sale, and territorial conquest in most cases is just too messy to be justified. Instead of carving up the world into neat little sections, we'd expect a carving up process that's a hell of a lot more chaotic. It'll focus on capturing and securing a hold over supply chains rather than resource-rich nations. It'll focus on controlling and manipulating financial networks and guarding them with robust digital infrastructure rather than looting and plundering outright. It'll be a highly asymmetric process where it's entirely likely that, let's say, Russia and China could each hold complete dominion over their own piece of infrastructure somewhere in Africa, even though each of their infrastructure is a mere 10 kilometers away from the other in the same sovereign nation, with a ruler who thinks they're playing both Russia and China simultaneously. It's a dynamic built for grey zone conflict, and for that reason, it's a dynamic where none of the three nations has any actual desire to respect the carving up process, but where proxy governments, mercenary organizations, cyberspace operators, and financial tools are the primary weapons used by all sides as they chip away at each other's holdings. And just some food for thought here, consider accounting for the long-term changes in relative power between these three nations, because the balance of power between the three of them today isn't going to be the balance of power tomorrow. Russia, struggling with Ukraine overheating its economy and staring down a succession crisis when Putin eventually kicks the bucket, is pretty clearly in a process of decline, and nuclear arsenals notwithstanding, it's already the weakest of the three. China is very clearly a great power ascendant. The United States, well, you decide on that one, but there are arguments in either direction or an argument for stagnation. Each of these three major powers is going to be making decisions with their future selves in mind, and that leads to a very different set of priorities for each one. A nation that knows it'll be more powerful tomorrow than it is today will bide its time and try to keep things stable. A nation that knows it's getting weaker is going to try and do as much as it can right now on the assumption that it won't be able to do the same things in the future. And a nation that's either stagnating or can't really figure out where it is prone to acting erratically in hopes of shaking up the status quo and putting itself back into a more favorable position. All right, and now we'll move on to some more specific questions. And the first comes from Noodleman Supreme. Fantastic username. Do you find it hard titling your videos properly? It must be hard finding a line between titling something to make people want to watch it and show it's important without fear-mongering, World War III, or clickbaiting. How do you find the line, and how often do you think you get it right? Dude, this is a massive pain in the ass. There was a time not so long ago where we could put out videos on this channel with kind of neutral titles and we'd still get loads of views. I mean, as of late last summer, we literally titled a video, Burkina Faso, the world's most neglected war. And the algorithm, that would kind of just serve it up to people interested in geopolitics. And then something just seemed to change. Don't know what, but it did. Videos with more balanced titles just started underperforming. It wasn't enough to just put out a good piece of analysis if we wanted people to watch it. Now, we actually had to think about a title, something screamingly good. And look, we agree with the implicit premise of this question. It sucks that everything on YouTube in 2025 does need to kind of look like clickbait. It sucks that a video called Sudan's Army Retakes Khartoum will get 7,000 views, while one title, The World's Worst War is Reaching Its Climax, will get 700,000. It sucks that the algorithm of people's viewing preferences created an endless need to make things seem ever more explosive and eye-catching. But we've talked about this over here, and our feeling is this. So long as the scripts themselves aren't veering into fear-mongering or misinformation, doesn't really matter what the titles are. If we can use a over-the-top title to get someone to watch an otherwise balanced, informative video that will leave them wiser about the world, well, I mean, that's pretty good than no one watching the balanced video, isn't it? In short, it's difficult, and we wish we didn't have to constantly be discussing where the line is, literally every time. And look, we try to keep on the right side of it, but it is inevitable that we occasionally do fall down on the wrong side. We're sorry about that, but our guiding light is always going to be that the content must remain unbiased or as unbiased as possible, and the information relative. So, how's that for an unsatisfactory answer? And our question from Pirate Emine that somehow manages to be both fun and also depressing. For your non-European audience, what is the one bit of Europe we should see before World War III plunges us all into a post-apocalypse? Oh no. We've all got different opinions about this on the team, so we thought we'd answer it in turn. Here's what our editor-in-chief Morris has to say. Although I should probably say Czech Republic since the channel is based here. I'm going to go and recommend Slovenia, which is basically the perfect holiday destination. You've got a tiny, beautiful capital city, great hiking up in the mountains, a short stretch of coastline dotted with old Venetian-style towns, and cuisine that is mad, delicious fusion of Italian, Austrian, and Balkan flavors. Also, the tiny wine region is as beautiful as any part of Italy, but noticeably cheaper. In short, if the continent is doomed to become an irradiated wasteland, this is the part to see before the mushroom clouds appear. Evan, regular contributor, says, I'm an American. Indeed he is, and have never lived in Europe, so I'm significantly less qualified to answer this. But as a visitor, I'd strongly recommend that everybody visits the city of Porto in Portugal at least once. It's a beautiful city, much more laid back than a place like Lisbon, and it's less of a place to go looking for tourist attractions than to book a relatively long stay and just breathe it in for a while. Also, pastéis de nata are very, very tasty. Indeed, they are, Evan. Good shout. And my answer, I went to Montenegro last year as part of a road trip. I drove kind of down south, and Montenegro, surprisingly beautiful. It was very beautiful. Just really a nice place to take a drive. Highly recommended. And also, before we continue, Matt Myers, 4832, led to slip that he's turning 21 today and that he'll be getting class at the bars before getting some late-night conflicts information from us. Matt, did you bribe someone on the team to slip this in? We never do this. Shout out! Okay, after that little cheery break, let's answer another fun one before we go back to discussing the dark and depressing questions. Rosie Applemontat asks, I'm a mad scientist with a time machine and forcing you to go back to war. You can pick which war. I'm nice like that. Which one are you going to take part in, Simon? I know where to put you, which side are you fighting for. Oh my God, go back in time. I'm going to choose it's got to be Cold War.
So it doesn't count. No.
And I want to be on the side of the Allies. America. Yes, please. No serious war. I don't want to get a gun and have to go fight. Thank you very much. Hard pass. I'd much rather the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, I suppose. And here's another behind-the-scenes question from BRDD514. This time a little darker. Because going back to fighting a war wasn't dark enough? What has been the hardest subject to cover, as in what's been the most difficult to research for a video, and what morally has been the most difficult? And we thought we'd answer this in turn. Morris says, in terms of hard to research, I've been wanting to do a video delving into the true death toll of the war in Sudan for about a year now, mostly because I suspect it's far worse than anyone imagines. But I've never managed to finish a script because there's just no solid information out there. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine did one acclaimed study, but it only looked into deaths in the Khartoum region alone, which makes it impossible to extrapolate across the rest of the country. Some major atrocities of the war, like the fall of El Janina and the subsequent mass killings, have been examined in depth, but in most cases, there's simply no research that we could draw on. As a result, published death tolls contain wildly different numbers. In the last major update in December, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project put the death toll at close to 29,000, which seems likely to be a vast undercount. The UN, meanwhile, estimated that around 40,000 had been killed. Back in May 2024, America's special envoy put the number closer to 150,000. The most pessimistic estimates suggest even this number may have now been exceeded many times over. In short, it's just impossible to say what the true death toll in Sudan is, and as such, we've never been able to release a video on the subject. Instead, we simply tried to keep on informing people about the worst conflict that the world is ignoring, a conflict that deserves our attention as much as anything happening in the Ukraine or the Middle East. Evan says, most difficult to research are any subjects located in places where reliable reporting is scarce or nearly non-existent. For example, there's an episode that I would love to write about the Wagner Group's degree of control over the Central African Republic, but many of the most compelling questions we could ask just don't have answers available in the public domain. The same is true if we're talking about on-the-ground links between rebel groups and organized crime in Myanmar, the role of tribal leaders fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia, the inner workings of life inside local militias fighting the cartels in Mexico, or any of the other groups living and fighting in places where reporting is outright dangerous for the journalists on the ground. We can do a lot using secondary analysis as a starting point, but it's not enough, and sometimes the information that people could gather from close range just doesn't make it into formats that we can access. As for what's been the most morally difficult, I've never done a script as gut-wrenching as the one I did on our sister channel, Into the Shadows. That's another channel we do, check it out if you want to, back in 2023. That episode was on Saydnaya prison in Syria. Oh my God, I remember this episode. Sorry, this is Simon, not Evan. Just go watch it. It's horrific. Which was basically just a black hole at the time, but was suspected to be a torture center on par with Nazi death camps, which is now confirmed to have been an accurate assessment. With stories that are that dark and with so many victims who've experienced some of the worst horrors people can inflict on each other, I've always felt that we can't do justice to the topic unless we really plumb the depths as writers and producers and force ourselves to confront the worst of it. A fair number of accounts I read and heard from survivors of the prison made it into the final script, but there were just some things in there that I just couldn't include, partly because the video would have been taken down. Not necessarily taken down, this is Simon again, but definitely age restricted, so nobody is going to see it, and definitely demonetized. I mean, it was probably demonetized anyway. Partly because it felt like a bridge too far to decide on behalf of our viewers that they should have to listen to the most horrific details. People who wanted to hunt those details down absolutely could do that. And we mentioned that in the episode, but they weren't something that we were comfortable putting in the final draft. And in a strange way, it's those details that I didn't exhale onto the page that have stuck with you the most, even multiple years after the fact. It doesn't ask for an answer from me here, but I think not necessarily the morally the most complex, but one of the most interesting things I find about kind of the morals of this all, the number of people who on Twitter, for my sins, I still go on there, who will one day be calling me a Zionist and the next day telling me that I'm a terrorist supporter is really quite something. I think it's okay for there to be a war where there are two bad guys and the only good guys being all the civilians who end up dying. That. Requiem for my hair. So after that answer, a palate cleanser. Cheese McBurger asks, I'm genuine interest why Simon went bald. Dude, like a decade. No. 13 years ago, I went bald at 25. I know. World leader scrubs. And now another run from Pirate Mine, who sent us roughly 1 billion questions. As you cover all of this conflict, do you have any one world leader you'd want to sit down with and ask, what the f*** are you doing? And if so, who? Okay, who are Evan and Morris going to choose? Evan goes first. Xi Jinping. Good shout, Evan, without a doubt. There are a lot of world leaders whose actions are shocking, but basically boil down to the idea that if they hit their enemies with a hammer as hard as possible, as many times as possible, then eventually lots of their problems would disappear. But at least from an external perspective, Xi seems to be a master at playing the long game, and I'd want to ask him what the f*** he's doing, and then sit back and listen to what would sure to be a very long answer. It would be fascinating to hear how all of the pieces of the puzzle fit together in Xi's own head, the master plan he's imagined, and probably the parts of China's long-term goals that are completely separate from his authority. Morris says Vladimir Putin. When Trump was re-elected, another good shout, the Kremlin was given the perfect chance to end the war on terms that would have greatly benefited Russia. That whole period back in spring, when the White House froze intelligence and weapons deliveries to Ukraine and Trump suggested Zelensky was the only obstacle to peace, well, that was the moment for Putin to step forward and hash out a dirty deal with America, one that would have left Europe in shock and fallen far short of Putin's original war goals, but that would have still been good enough to sell as a victory at home. Had Putin agreed to a ceasefire and stopped the aerial attacks back in March, it's likely he could have walked away with American recognition of Crimea as Russian and an unspoken agreement that the parts of eastern Ukraine currently under occupation would likely never be returned to Kyiv. Nor would that have been all he got. Remember, at this point, Trump was talking about ending sanctions and welcoming Moscow back into the international community. There were discussions about America even participating with Russia to produce advanced AI, a deal that would have benefited Russia far more than it benefited the USA. Putin could have banked all of that and then spent the next 5 years rebuilding his army and undermining Ukraine, preparing to relaunch his invasion the moment Trump left office. And after 4 more years of uncertainty and economic pain, it's probable that Kyiv would have fallen. And to be clear, this would have been horrific for all of us. But from Putin's perspective, it would have been a perfect off-ramp with a clear victory and a plan for the future. And all he had to do was stop killing civilians, stop sending his own soldiers to their deaths for just a short while. But he couldn't. To paraphrase Black Sabbath, the war machine kept turning. I would honestly want to look this war pig right in the eye and ask him why he just couldn't take the win. For my answer, I'd have to say probably I would choose Xi from Evans, but seeing as Evan already chose Xi, I'd go for Netanyahu, but everyone knows what the fuck he's up to. Can Musk count? I know he's not really a world leader, but he's kind of on the edges of power, and I just feel for a man who is clearly very intelligent. He just makes endless blunders. I'd just like to ask you about why you can't stop making blunders, Elon Musk. Why? Why do you have to do this? Why do you have to be like this? And now, final question that makes us all smile, and I'll send on a less depressing note. Oakley X asks, I'm often cooking dinner when watching WarFronts videos. Hello there. Wonder what you're cooking today. What would Simon and the team want me to cook for them? Morris says it's got to be schmazak. Oh, that's very specific and very Czech. It's a deep fried to perfection and served with thick-cut chips, what Americans call fries, and a side helping of tartar sauce, all washed down with half a litre of pivo, which is beer. Diabolical for the waistline, great for the side. I think Morris there mentions what schmazak is. It's a deep-fried cheese. I actually just had a schmazak with Morris. Not last night, but the night before. Evan says, I'm always up to trying something new and I enjoy learning more about people through the food they enjoy, and especially the food that's important to them. Oh, Evan, that's so open-minded of you. It's not going to be my answer. So I'll ask you to make your own favourite comfort food. However, you give yourself, I know. For me, ribeye, medium rare, preferably some from South America, definitely aged, thin-cut fries, or chips, if I'm feeling particularly British. Truffle sauce. Side... weird one, Brussels sprouts. Roasted Brussels sprouts cut in half. I just like them. I know they just taste weirdly good. And that's it. Thanks for all your questions. We do one of these AMAs every quarter, so keep an eye out for our next community post. If you want to get our thoughts on something, it should be up sometime in October. Also, subscribe to our newsletter. Why not? It doesn't even say that here, but you should. It's great. It goes out twice a week and it keeps you informed. And it's free. Yes, completely free. Like this channel. Yes, please. Until then, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week for our regular coverage. Have a good one.